The Israeli military launched deadly strikes on the southern Gazan city of Rafah overnight on Saturday that killed 22 people, including 18 children, health officials say. Among the affected was a baby who was saved from her dying mother's womb after the airstrike in Rafah. She was named after her mother, who did not survive. More than half of Gaza's population has sought safety in Rafah to escape fighting in the Israel-Hamas conflict following October 7th, the attack on October 7th. The war has killed more than 34,000 Palestinians, at least two-thirds of them women and children, according to local health officials. During a press briefing last week, Pentagon Press Secretary, Air Force Major General Pat Ryder, responded to questioning on Israeli efforts to evacuate people out of Rafah ahead of a potential invasion.
We've heard from an Israeli source that the Israelis have made significant progress in preparations to evacuate roughly 1 million people out of Rafah ahead of any possible operations there, and that the U.S. is aware of these efforts, which include preparing areas to the north with repairing pipes and setting up tents. Can you speak to those efforts, and does the relocation of these people meet with the sort of recommendations the U.S. is making to the Israelis as they proceed?
I really can't.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a statement Sunday, "In the coming days, we will increase the political and military pressure on Hamas because this is the only way to bring back our hostages and achieve victory. We will land more and painful blows on Hamas soon." Saturday's strikes on Rafah came the same day the U.S. House of Representatives approved a $26 billion aid package for the Middle East. The legislative body greenlighted $17 billion of military aid for Israel and $9 billion for aid into Gaza. The Senate is expected to pass the bill this week, which will then send it to President Joe Biden to sign into law.
Netanyahu says the bill demonstrates strong bipartisan support for Israel and defends Western civilization. Thank you, friends. Thank you, America.
This comes as medical forensics teams uncovered a mass grave reportedly created by Israeli forces next to Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip that was recently overrun by Israeli forces. 180 bodies have been found so far, according to Al Jazeera. The United States is expected to announce sanctions against multiple Israeli military units over human rights violations in the West Bank. Two U.S. sources told the Times of Israel yesterday. First, the U.S. was looking to sanction the IDF unit, Netza Yuda Battalion, but according to sources, it is now mulling sanctions over other units. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz urged U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to not go ahead with sanctions in separate talks yesterday, Israeli officials said.
Now, this all falls ahead of the start of the Passover holiday this week. FBI Director Christopher Wray said law enforcement is on alert for any potential threats to the Jewish community. He said last week, "We at the Bureau remain particularly concerned that lone actors could target large gatherings, high-profile events, or symbolic or religious locations for violence, particularly a concern, of course, as we look to the start of the Passover on Monday evening."
All right, lots to get into here. First, I think Rafah is the big question hanging in the air. Biden established Rafah as a red line of sorts, saying that he did not recommend a ground invasion because of the humanitarian consequences. But as you saw in the clip with the spokesperson, the State Department spokesperson there, when asked whether or not he had more information as to what Israel had done to avoid the kind of cataclysmic humanitarian disaster that would naturally accrue with a ground invasion or an attack on the over half of the civilian population, which is now sequestered, seeking refuge in Rafah, there was no response. Despite that, we saw these attacks over the weekend, which have seen casualties disproportionately falling on children, with 18 out of the 22 dead, and not to mention the child that was rescued from her mother's womb who did not survive. And I think there is an ongoing question as to whether or not Biden is actually going to treat this as a red line, or, according to reporting which the White House pushed back against last week, it had made a sort of a deal with the devil and saying, all right, we're going to look the other way on Rafah if you agree not to strike back against Iran.
But they did strike back against Iran anyway. That's the point. Biden said there was no need for further retaliation in that direction, and it looked like Israel was going to hold off, and then it went ahead and did it anyway. They're doing Rafah anyway, and we just wrote them another check.
Right.
So I think at some point, doesn't there have to be tremendous frustration among some of the American people who are skeptical of all this foreign aid, which we're talking about, at other points in the show today about the horrible package of bills that were passed over the weekend. But it does appear that these red lines are just, they walk right across them. Netanyahu walks right across them and nothing happens. And so, what is the point of our diplomacy, the point of our spending should be to get on foreign governments, right? Even if the people who believe in that we should do that, it's to get something diplomatically that the U.S. wants. Yeah. And so if we're spending our money, if we're giving our money, the hard-working U.S. taxpayers' money to other governments, and then we're not getting out of those governments the diplomatic goals that we want met, what is the point? And does it speak to the powerlessness of the presidency or of this president in particular, who seems to be totally ignored by Netanyahu to an extent, frankly, that his predecessors were not?
Yeah, and look, we're seeing people like John Fetterman push back against the idea there being any consequences for any Israeli action, whether it's reporting over these mass graves, whether it's the reporting over a doctor who says through family that she has been not just kind of arrested and detained, but tortured by the IDF, whether it's the discovery of now multiple mass graves where people have been found in hospital scrubs with IVs still in their arms, bound and buried, presumably by the IDF after they've taken control of these various medical facilities. It's getting increasingly difficult for the average American to defend. And we're seeing that reflected in the poll numbers. But in terms of what large numbers of members of Congress are willing to support, including very vocal pro-Israel factions like that are represented by people like John Fetterman, he's coming out and saying we shouldn't even respect American law that already exists in terms of the Leahy Act, which would preclude us from giving aid to countries that are violating our international humanitarian norms. We're at a place where when journalists ask Spokes Department people whether or not there have been investigations or corroborations or any follow-up on all of the evidence that's now been pouring out over the course of the last almost 7 months now about these kind of humanitarian violations, mum is the word, and you can see why. Because if they were to agree to it, it would naturally trigger consequences in terms of the amount of aid that can be given. So we're in this bizarre limbo, and it does seem like it's only going to continue to drive the public, people on both sides of the aisle, further and further away from seeing Joe Biden as the pro-democratic, lesser of two evil style choice that he's been modeling himself to be for the duration of this election season.
Yeah, well, the U.S. government never wants to acknowledge that there are limits or obstacles that would stop them from spending money, like the Leahy Amendment, right? They don't want to concede that. I mean, it's obvious what's going on in these press briefings. Like, the administration knows that the optics of what's happening in Gaza are very bad, that the high number of casualties of women and children are embarrassing and are disgusting and are turning people away from this conflict. But they think, for whatever reason, it is important to not only just continue to vocally support Israel, but to continue to fund Israel. That's their priority. So they have to pretend they're looking into this. We're concerned about this. We're communicating our disapproval of this. They don't actually, it doesn't seem like they really, trying to read their motives. They actually care about that. They just know that you care. They know that the reporters in the room care, and they know that some of their own voters care, but they're not going to do anything about it.
And I think that's exactly right. And this raises the fundamental concern about the role of corporate interest and money and lobbying in our American political system. I talk about this a lot in the context of some of the left priorities that I think are populist, working class priorities when you see the polls, whether it's Medicare for all, living wage, these kinds of things. And, people have we have, well-rehearsed political battles about those issues. An issue like this, I think, shines new light on the disproportionate influence moneyed interests and lobbying groups have on the direction that Congress is willing to take, even when there is such obvious consensus among the public that they disagree with that congressional direction. So even if you didn't see it clearly in, let's say, a Medicare for All context, here we're seeing that a sitting president running for re-election who's behind his opponent in the polls is getting an incredible amount of heat for an international, like a foreign policy choice that is deeply unpopular. And the clear solution seems to be reverse course. Why won't he reverse course? These are the kind of questions that people have to ask. And when you see AIPAC pledging to spend $100 million in congressional races against pro-Palestinian candidates, or candidates that even caution any sort of restraint for Israel as it conducts this war in Gaza, you start to get a better picture of what's really motivating the direction of politics.
I have some skepticism of that, though, because John Fetterman, for instance, has dramatically improved his approval ratings over the course of the last few months by articulating this stridently anti-Gaza, anti-Palestinian, anti-left standpoint. Biden is, if anything, improving in the polls, as we're going to talk about later in the show. I wonder if if going against progressive protesters even harder would further solidify his standing in the polls. But I'm not denying that money plays a role in what the decisions these people are making are, but I think public sentiment is not as...
I do think with the Fetterman example, he was someone suffering from low approval ratings, largely because he had suffered a stroke in the lead up to the election. Republicans were very critical of him, have been bashing him right up until October 7th. And now I think if you disaggregate the numbers, what you're going to see is the left base that got him elected and supported him through has completely abandoned him. He's getting very strong approval numbers from conservatives, war hawks within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both. So are those the kinds of people that can actually sustain him in office? Well, it's a long time since he's going to have to face re-election. But the point of the matter is, that's the question that most people in the House of Representatives are going to have to face in a much more abbreviated timeline. And Joe Biden, principally, it's undeniable when you see the vote tallies of the uncommitted movement in crucial swing states that he needs to win. If twice as many people came out to vote not for Biden, for uncommitted, for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, then he needed to win, or that then the margin by which he won in 2020 or lost in the Democrats lost in 2016 in these swing states like Wisconsin and Michigan, then the writing's on the wall. And so he can take that kind of a gamble. But it's not, I think, progressives or the anti-war movement that's fronting that risk. It is Joe Biden that's choosing to ignore the tea leaves, as it were.
We'll have more Rising right after this.